Ah yes, Final Fantasy XIII, a game I wanted to talk about / review for a long time now. But as the channel was getting packed with uncompleted series, I decided to wait until I had completed one. Which I did a couple of weeks ago. Well, sorta, as the newest Sword Art Online game is already on the horizon, so yeah. Before that game comes out, let's quickly dive into Final Fantasy XIII, and hopefully the other games, cause there's a lot to talk about. Like how the Final Fantasy XIII series completely changed the standard formula of Final Fantasy. Or how amazing the graphics are in these games. Or how weird the combat system is. Or the insane amount of untapped waifu potential Lightning has. Yeah, like I said, there's a lot to talk about. So without further ado, let's get started with Final Fantasy XIII. As you might know, Final Fantasy XIII is considerably an old game. It was released in 2009/2010, yet you can barely see that when looking at the graphics. In particular, its CGI. Though, keep in mind, that is the element Square Enix excels at in older games. Now, I'm not saying that it's the major selling point of the Final Fantasy series, but it does always attract a lot of attention. I would be lying if I said that I wasn't attracted by this game's graphics. I mean, look at it. This game's CGI looks absolutely amazing, and it truly brings this fantasy world to life with vibrant colors and realistic look. Even when the cinematography gets a bit wonky at times, you can still see the insane amount of details everywhere. And when we leave the CGI behind and get to the in-game graphics, it still looks great considering the time period this game was released. In the same year that Final Fantasy XIII was released, Dragon Age Origin, Modern Warfare 2, Assassin's Creed 2 and Left 4 Dead 2 all came out as well. And while I love many of these games, I do think that when it comes to graphics, they can't compete with Final Fantasy XIII. And while it's great that Square Enix seems not to have spared any expense on fancy and beautiful graphics, to me, graphics are meaningless and just window dressing if the game itself has no good, fun or interesting content. And that is where for many, and myself, Final Fantasy XIII gets a bit tricky. The story in Final Fantasy XIII follows a ragtag group of people that are branded as l'Cie. Being branded as such means they are granted a focus, which boils down to a goal, or fate. If they fail to complete their focus in the given time, they are turned into these zombie-esque things called Cieth, making their adventure a race against time, morals, and fate. On this adventure, we see this ragtag group of people grow by themselves and towards one another, as they are bound to the same goal, yet each of them have different ideals and thoughts about it. This logically creates a lot of conflict within the group, making them even split up at times, which is where the writing shines, as in these moments, characters grow very subtle and create natural bonds with one another, as they are forced to work together, seeing each other's weaknesses and strengths, while reflecting on their own. There is, however, an unfair divide in screen time, which becomes most noticeable when the group is together. Some characters just clearly are the main focus of the story, which leaves the rest behind, but not forgotten, as they, and of course the other characters, have great visual designs. Each looks very distinct and diverse, which makes them stand out on their own despite not having the same degree of development as the main cast. A problem that is mentioned by many whenever this game is discussed is the excessive amount of time spent on the story. This game is roughly 40 to 50 hours long, and 1/4 of that runtime is spent on cutscenes alone, which I agree is a decent chunk of time, but it's not something I personally consider as an issue. Because again, graphically the game looks great and the cinematography is nothing to complain about for most of the time. My problem with the cutscenes is that the time spent on them, which again is a lot, is poorly used to tell the story itself. Final Fantasy XIII loves to throw a lot of terms at you, but then doesn't take the time to define them properly. On top of that, many of them sound a lot alike. l'Cie, fal'Cie, pulse l'Cie, and fal'Cie, Cieth? It goes on, and it's therefore understandable that for some this causes confusion. And I had a similar experience the first time playing this game back in 2010. The answer to what, for example, a l'Cie is, or what any of the other before mentioned terms are, can be found in the game. Keyword here, can be found. Everything you want, but more importantly need to know, can be found in the codex/database. Personally, I see something like that as a way to enhance the story, but here it's used to make up for the holes the writing in the cutscenes leave. Which, considering how much time we spend on cutscenes, should not be necessary, at least not to the degree that happens here. Every time a cutscene ends, I wanted to know more. I wanted to learn from what this story had to tell or what this world was. But instead of telling that in the cutscenes, the game coldly directs me to the database. Which is just something I really, and I do mean really, don't like. But the thing is, however, when you put in the effort to read the complete database and to connect all the dots, the story and the world is actually quite nice. I fell in love with the design of the world and the lore behind it. Until this day, it feels so unique and looks so different from any other Final Fantasy game, yet it feels so typical Final Fantasy at the same time. I also absolutely love the approach the story has about destiny and how tricky that can be. It sheds a light on how destiny can conflict with people, be it with their beliefs or feeling of justice. It also shows what destiny could do to a person when fear or dire consequences are implied. There are many layers of story and lore to be found here, and I love it. And I freaking hate it, because I wish the writing would have done it more justice. Instead, it almost solely depends on your willingness to put in the effort to read a complete lore database. And even if you're willing, you can still beg the question if you have the time and energy to put up that kind of effort. Because if you're a newcomer to this game, the combat system already demands a lot of you. Until this point, most Final Fantasy games had a turn-based combat system. Something that I personally always liked and loved of this series, especially when I was younger. But ever since Final Fantasy X, Square Enix has been trying to change up the standard format. In recent years, Final Fantasy XV and the remake of Final Fantasy VII showed that Square Enix managed to create a successful new path for the series' combat system and reach a larger audience. But before they got to that point, they experimented with some other combat systems, and Final Fantasy XIII's combat system is one of them. Some people call this combat system real-time turn-based or even bordering on action-based combat. Personally, I'm leaning somewhat towards the former one, however, I still recognize a lot of the old game's combat system here, even though it looks drastically different. To me, the combat didn't really change, instead it's the role you play in it that really changed. In previous games you played more as a party manager, where you have to decide every move for every character individually at every single turn. In Final Fantasy XIII, you play more as a battle observer and leader. Direct input in battles is drastically lower here. You just can't tell your party members what exactly to do. Instead, you instruct your party members as leader to play and switch between roles and trust them they will live up to it, while you, as the party leader, focuses on your own role while overviewing the state of the battle. When a tactic doesn't work or a change of approach is desired, you are the one that makes those calls. You do that via the paradigm system. Is your party hurt or weakened? Switch to a healing focused paradigm, where one character assumes a healing role instead of a DPS one. Do you see an opening for extra damage or even to stagger the enemy? Switch to a more aggressive paradigm, where support and healing roles are not present in. Now, just like with the story, I really love and hate what they're doing here. The idea itself is great, it's cool, and I love it. During many encounters, you really feel like you're placed in a role of leadership. You can't plan out a lot of moves ahead of time like in the old games, or have perfect combos. Combat is chaotic and brings a lot of uncertainties, which you need to predict and counter in moments' notice. Though switching paradigms is not always the solution. You have to keep in mind that switching paradigms has a huge impact on your battle performance, as your party is limited to only 3 active members. Small course corrections actually can be a bad move and cost you the battle, as you're focusing on the wrong things, which the game then punishes you for ruthlessly. Again, I love this. The saying "the battle is won before it's fought" applies heavily here. You need to do your homework before you can start fighting. Invest in your party's roles, create the proper paradigms, check equipment, and so on. Like, if you don't do those things or you do it wrongly, fights will be rough and in some cases even impossible. Now, I'm not saying the older Final Fantasy games were a walk in the park, but of all the games I played in the series, I never felt so harshly punished for making a mistake or felt so outmatched by my opponent at times. And the best thing of all, there is no option to cheese or grind your way to victory. Progression for the characters is locked to the story, so you will always hit some kind of wall. And the summons, while looking really cool, are not nearly as strong as they were in the other Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy XIII is designed to be a quite difficult game, a challenge to beat, and it strives to stay challenging all the way till the end. To beat this game, you need, just like with the story, invest a lot of time in understanding the combat system and the encounters you face. But that is also the reason why I hate this combat system at times. While I think it's great that this game avoids a problem most other games have, where as you gain more power and level up, battles will ultimately change from possible wins to probable and even guaranteed wins. But this constant challenge and large time investment is also the reason why I get fatigued and burned out by this game at times. Another problem here is that with certain enemies the combat can start to feel very mundane and even boring, as the challenge disappears once you figured out the right tactic. An encounter can easily take 3 to 5 minutes, or even more, and all you will be doing once you know how it's done is waiting. Waiting for the right moment to switch paradigm, which will give you the win. These problems are the reason why I don't play this game for longer periods of time. After 4, 5 or so hours, I just call it a day, as either the novelty of the challenge starts to wear off, or I had some really long, boring encounters in a row. Thankfully, the linear design of the game supports taking regular breaks, which I took, and after such a break, the first encounter feels again very exciting, as my hunger for the challenge and my determination was reinvigorated. But none of these problems applied when it comes to boss battles, even though they are fairly similar to normal encounters. To me, the boss battle serves as a difficulty check, to see if you understood the combat and if you have learned and grown into it. During these battles you are kept on your toes, more than usual, pushing you to uncomfortable limits, be it by strong attacks or tactics, or even by cheap dirty design tricks, like a timer or recovery skills. But when you beat a boss battle, in particular the ones that end up being nail biters, you get a darn satisfying feeling. And I love that feeling. The feeling of accomplishment, that I overcame the struggle not by a grind or some clever skill point investment, but by just playing and understanding the game. Though that feeling does not completely compensate for the fact that losing in this game can also feel very rough and unfair at times, especially if you performed well during the battle, yet a timer or a cheap trick wipes you off the board. But hey, if that happens, it means you got to redo the fight, which in turn means you get to listen more to this game's fantastic soundtrack, something that is barely mentioned when the game is discussed, which is a huge shame, but also very understandable. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love this game, but it's by no means perfect. It actually has a lot of problems, and during all my playthroughs there have been many moments where I actually hated this game. But those are moments where the game seemingly plays off on my weaknesses than anything else. I think that is why I am fascinated by this and every other game in the 13 series. It manages to bring the best and worst out of me. And I think that is why I also understand very well when people bring up the reasons why they don't like this game or even hate it. This game does so many things I'm just not a fan of either. Hiding the lore and an inspiring story mostly in a database, creating a good and interesting combat system that will challenge you constantly, keeping you on your toes and redefining your party every other battle is fun and great, but you easily get burned out by it as well. But when you put up with it and invest your time and effort, this game becomes a great experience. I would describe Final Fantasy XIII as a weird jigsaw puzzle consisting of things I love and hate in general when it comes to video games. But it's ultimately something I love, as whenever you make progress in this puzzle, when you take another step forward, uncover something new, and eventually beat it, the satisfaction of it is immense. I do not consider Final Fantasy XIII to be as bad as people make it out to be. It's not perfect, but it's not bad either. It's just very niche and not for everyone, as it requires a lot of time and effort from the player to actually shine. Therefore, I find it hard to really recommend Final Fantasy XIII. I would only recommend this game to people if they are able to keep a very open mind while being prepared to invest lots of time and effort while being challenged every step of the way. The Steam version actually comes with an easy mode, which makes things obviously easy, and you could opt for that if you're willing to put in the effort for the story but not for the combat. But after 3 playthroughs, I still consider the combat an essential part of the Final Fantasy XIII experience. Which, if you really want that, then the before mentioned requirements apply.